Hello, this is Deb Wenger. You are now at the point where you have all of the building blocks, or nearly all of the building blocks, in place for building your story. But today we're going to talk about how you should structure it and how you should go about adding the context that people will need to fully understand the news of what you have to write. So there's an approach, a structure for stories that's called the inverted pyramid. This is one of the most common story structures out there. It's widely used in print or text-style stories, whether they're published in print or online. So the inverted pyramid says that the base of the pyramid should include the most newsworthy information. So this is where your lead is going to be, and any essential elements that help you understand or that support the lead. So remember, we're not going to answer all the who, what, when, why, where, and how in that lead sentence, but in part one, we're likely to get at almost all of those, if not all of those. So this most newsworthy information that makes up the base of the pyramid is where you're really going to answer those critical key questions. The second part is going to continue to include important and relevant details, but likely you could understand the primary elements of the piece without reading on to part two. And then part three is going to be other background information or another angle potentially on the story that is nice to have. But if you just read part one, or just read part one and part two, you would have a pretty good understanding of the story and the issues surrounding it. So it might be helpful to demonstrate this by showing you in a news story itself. So here there is an example of flooding in Colorado. And you'll see that the first sentence, the summary lead, reads, emergency officials say at least 1,000 people in one Colorado county are still waiting to be rescued from floodwaters, but adverse weather conditions have grounded helicopters and supply drops. Okay, so that's a good summary lead. Tells you what's happening, gives you a sense of where. So it's in Colorado, obviously. And it gives you enough details that if you're at all interested in weather stories or Colorado or your fellow man, you might be prompted to read on. So the second sentence gives you support for that lead. It comes from the expert emergency management team leader who basically tells you a little bit more about what's going on. You'll see a partial quote here. The waiting game that authorities are having to play due to the rain lets you know that people who are stranded have been in communication for the most part with officials, but that they're just not able to get to them. This supports the information that you've already seen in the lead. Now this is a very short story. This last line with forecasters predicting more rain potentially on the way. That's not essential to your understanding of what's happening in Colorado, but it does add some additional information that helps you understand just how critical the situation is in Colorado. Okay, so in part one of your story that you'll be writing, you're going to have a summary lead, which is going to be a big part of the base of the pyramid. So that needs to have enough information for the reader to know what the story is about and what is the news element of this story. You want to make it compelling enough to keep the reader engaged, and most likely you are going to get to a quote after one or two sentences. So let's take a look at another story. Here the lead says, in the age of cyberbullying, a suburban Los Angeles school district is taking a novel approach. It's paying a company tens of thousands of dollars to snoop on students' social media pages. All right, again, doesn't answer all of the who, what, when, why, where, and how in that first sentence, But as we go through what I would consider part one of this story, you're going to get to most of those questions, if not all of them. So notice again that this story builds from that first sentence and starts to explain a little bit more. But while officials in Glendale look at monitoring as a safeguard against bullying, suicide, and other alarming behavior, some students and civil rights advocates say the school district is being an unnecessarily nosy big brother. So now we've answered a more specific where, so this is in Glendale. And note that we get pretty quickly to a quote from a student who is not happy about this monitoring. We add more details. So how much does all of this cost? We learn it's $40,500 to track posts by 14,000 students. Explains a little bit more about how the students are being monitored. So all of that makes up part one. Typically in inverted pyramid, part two is going to have more explanatory quotes, so more details about how this particular story is unfolding, the impact that the information that you're reporting might be having on society or a neighborhood or an individual. And then it's also going to include a little bit more context and background that the reader needs to fully understand the story. So if we look at part two of this story, beginning with a pilot program was first launched last year in the district's 3 high schools, here you get some background information to say, okay, they didn't just jump in and start doing this without making sure that they knew what the impact would be. They tested it in some high schools, and you get a quote from the school superintendent who is very positive about what they've learned through the pilot program, and is supportive of what's happening. So you've had a quote from someone who is concerned about it. Now you have a quote from someone who's in support of it. Gives us a little bit more detail about how this program is implemented. So we know that the company does not have a list of names, and uses some other kind of algorithm to track students. The founder of the company also explains that these are students who are 13 or older. Otherwise, parents are required to have permission. That says to me, it's also telling me that parents don't have to give permission if a student is older than 13. Okay, so here in parts 1 and 2, you get all of the who, what, when, why, where, and how answered. We're now into some details that just provide deeper context and meaning for the story. In part 3, this is where you're really bringing in more details that might help someone who's really interested in this story. But every story is going to have a part 3 from the standpoint of every story has to have an ending, right? And you want that ending to be as compelling as possible. So you'll see fairly often something called a close quote. So it's a quote from someone who seems to put the story in context or in perspective, or who puts a period on the story, who says, so this is ultimately what it means. You might also do a look ahead to what's next. So if you're covering a story that's going to have additional developments expected, let's say there's a story that comes out that says Ole Miss is going to stop allowing freshmen to have cars on campus. Well, when that story comes out, there's likely to be many more steps in the process before it actually happens. So you might look ahead to what's next. Sometimes you might use a summary ending. In a summary ending, you're going to try to recap for the reader what the most important elements of the story are, but you need to be a little cautious with that. Take the parking story, for example, with freshmen no longer allowed to bring cars on campus. Well, you may have a strong opinion about that. You need to make sure that your summary ending doesn't expose what your point of view is on the story. Now here's part 3 of this particular story. So we have heard from students, we've heard from the superintendent, we've heard from the company that's doing the monitoring, but we also know from our lead that there is concern from people who look out for civil rights, the Civil Liberties Union, for example. Now, this information isn't essential to your understanding of the story. You don't need to have specifics from the Civil Liberties Union in terms of what it is that they are concerned about, but it makes the story richer. And the story also ends on what we talked about is a closed quote from someone representing the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And they describe how this kind of monitoring is different than just a teacher knowing that a student is doing something inappropriate and reporting it. He says it's not stumbling into students like a teacher running across a student on the street. This is a school sending someone to watch them. So that puts a period on the story and gives you a sense of what at least one side is concerned about when it comes to this new practice. All right, so before you begin to write, I think you need to do some thinking. So you need to think about what it is you still need to tell a story in this inverted pyramid style. So all along we've been talking about you have to know what is the news of your story. So you have to know what's different, what's new, what's most important. You have to be able to answer those questions so that you're able to tell people something that they don't already know. And again, this can be tricky with stories that are done fairly routinely at the university. Lots of student journalists doing lots of stories. You get the same ones over and over. So your mission is to find something new. One thing that might help you is having additional data that can help people understand the story. You might have to go and do some additional interviews or uncover some additional background. So your work may not yet be done. Sometimes you can Google and find a great statistic that people might not have heard before that you can use to grab their attention in the lead. Maybe you have to go back to one of your interviews and find out how much something costs or how many people are involved. Maybe something is about to happen in 2 or 3 days. Maybe that becomes your lead because that adds an element of timeliness. So you should have everything you need to begin producing this story, but it's not uncommon for journalists to have to keep reporting even as they begin writing. So you're going to want to get on Blackboard and you're going to start your story. You are going to state the news of your story in a 1-sentence summary lead. So this is writing the lead sentence, the base of the pyramid for your story. And then you're going to go on to create a story outline and post it to Blackboard discussions. There's another explanation of what it is that you need to do there under discussions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me and I'll try to walk you through the process.